Welcome to the Embassy of Ireland's celebrations of St. Bridget's Day. I'm Sheila Maguire and I'm the Ambassador of Ireland to Spain. And I'm delighted and thankful to be joined here this morning by Emilie Pine and by Pilar Villar-Argaiz. Before I hand over to them, there was just a few brief remarks I wanted to make, a few words of welcome. In many parts of the world, Irish embassies are this week celebrating St. Bridget's Day. And our intention is to celebrate the creativity and the achievements of Irish women. And I wanted to open by thanking Pilar and all of the members of AIDE, of the Association of Irish Studies in Spain, for that support that they give to Irish writers, and in the week that's in it, if I could say in particular to Irish women writers. Thank you very much. And a special hello to the members of that association and their members who are tuned in this morning. As we celebrate Irish women's achievements, I think we're also celebrating their resilience. And we know that these values of tolerance, of respect for diversity, of justice for all, that these values haven't always been as dominant in our country, and I think in other countries, as they should have been. And I think that they're values that all of us need to promote and to cherish and to practice all the time. And I think at the heart of this is honesty. And we were just chatting with Emilie before we came online about her recent engagement with the Hay Festival in Cartagena. And I tuned into that, as I know did Pilar. And during that, Emilie spoke about honesty, about admitting the things that we don't always feel comfortable admitting, and about speaking and writing of the silences that people are carrying around inside them. And I think that Emilie is part of that insistence, that important insistence in Ireland of speaking now of silences, because that's the way I think we can best protect the vulnerable around us. And so I'm really looking forward to this conversation, Emilie, and thank you for your work to date, and thank you for agreeing to be part of this today. I also want to thank Pilar, as I said before, but also my team in the embassy, Rory and Anne-Marie, for having the idea and for making this happen. It's our first Bridget's Day event, and I hope generally that this type of online event we can roll out during the course of the year across different areas, because we miss being together. The final thing I wanted to say was, your questions are welcome. There's an option on the webpage that you signed on. It's called Slido. We already have a few questions. We won't be able to get to all of them, but we'll certainly aim to get to some of them. And then maybe before I leave, just to say we've uploaded on our Twitter account this year's message from President Higgins about St. Bridget's Day. And I do recommend it. One of the things he says in his message, of course, is that this is a day in Ireland that's traditionally a day when we feel spring has started. Anish Chachtanari, as the poet Rafter has said, now that it's St. Bridget's Day, spring is coming. So after a very difficult year, that sense that the days are getting longer, that the vaccine is coming, that things will get better, and soon we can be together again. So with that, let me pass over. Pilar, te paso la palabra. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias, Sheila. Thank you very much. Good morning to everybody who is joining us today, this morning. Thank you very much to the Irish Embassy for counting on AIDE, the Spanish Association of Irish Studies, and for inviting me to moderate this talk on their behalf. And thank you as well to Sheila for all her support, and to the Irish Embassy all throughout the years. For me, it's a tremendous pleasure to introduce Emilie Pine, best-selling author, critically acclaimed writer. Emilie Pine is professor in modern drama at University College. She's the editor of Irish University Review, and she's the author of the best-selling book, Note to Self, which was published in 2018, and it was awarded the Irish Book of the Year award for that very same year. It was later translated into different languages, including Spanish, something that I would like to talk to her about later on. Emilie is director of the Irish Memory Studies Research Network, and she's also major project, Industrial Memories, a digital witnessing of the 2009 report of the Commission to Inquire into Child Abuse. And later today, I would like to talk to her about how this sort of academic work of hers influenced influences her writing. So Emilie, lovely to see you. Last time we saw each other, it was this time last year at the University of Granada, the south of Spain. How are you, Emilie?
Oh, well, I wish I were in Spain with you so much. It's a country that I really love. And it's been so wonderful to have the kind of exchanges I think that Irish and Spanish writers have, because we share so much, even though we have, kind of very different cultures in many ways, and unfortunately different climates. It looks lovely and sunny where you are. It's very cold in Ireland. I think we're getting, the first day of spring, it very much feels like a mental decision as opposed to a climate one. But yeah, we are weathering the storm, I think.
Good, Emilie. Well, I'm so excited to be conducting this conversation. The first time I read Note to Self, I read it in one sitting. And I think certainly the book has meant a huge turning point in women's stories, not only in Ireland, but also outside of Ireland. You openly talk about issues, as Sheila was saying in the introduction, which are still in many circles considered taboo or difficult to talk about, not only living with a person with some sort of addiction, but also the painful experience of miscarriage, of experiencing sexual violence, infertility, even the experience of menstruation itself. So how did it come to write this book? When did you decide that you wanted to become a writer and to start talking about your story?
It's a great question. It's a kind of both a simple and a complicated answer, right? The way it always is. I always wanted to be a writer, and I became an academic, which involves quite a lot of writing, right? But in a very particular way, right? Academics write with a very objective voice. We have to be distant and analytical and always talking about someone else's work, and which I think is wonderful, and it's work that I love. But I always had this kind of dream in the back of my mind. And I think I kind of put it away. I thought, well, maybe that's not going to happen. And that was because I was, hadn't written my first novel in my 20s. So it must be over for me. And actually, what I found was with writing Notes to Self, I think we're slightly losing Pilar, but I'm going to keep going anyway.
You're back. Don't worry.
You referred to living with someone with addiction, and that was the starting point for the book for me. My father had been an alcoholic all of my life, and alcohol abuse is obviously a big social problem in many countries. But I grew up in this kind of silence, as the ambassador referred to, where everybody knew it, but nobody would ever name it, that he was an alcoholic. And then finally in 2013, and he lives in Greece, by the way, finally in 2013, he went into liver failure and very nearly died. He made it, and he hasn't had a drink since 2013. So in many ways, it's a very happy ending. Sorry, this is a bit of a plot spoiler for anybody who hasn't read it. In many ways, it's a very happy ending, but I still found it incredibly difficult. There was a year where he was in and out of hospital and in intensive care, and it was just very, very challenging. And I wrote it. It was my only way of getting it out of my body and into a different format so I could look at it. So I wrote it down, and I never intended for anybody else to ever read it. It really was, which is why the English language title is Notes to Self. It really was something I was doing for myself. And then my partner found the pages that I had printed out, and he said, this is really good. And I think it's amazing. And I think so many people, I think women in particular, but so many people need a tiny bit of praise in order to value what they do, right? That we think that what we're doing isn't good enough. And culturally, I think women are told that all the time. And so from him saying to me, this is good writing, not just, an interesting story, but this is good writing, I began to believe in it and to imagine what it could possibly be. And I was very lucky to work with Tramp Press, who are a small, independent, feminist Irish publisher. They publish books that other people don't publish. So in relation to today, they have a great tradition of publishing at least one book a year from the Irish archive. So particularly books by women. They've published 3 out-of-print books by Dorothy McCardle to try and say these are stories that didn't get attention the first time around, because of, you know, being in a patriarchal culture. And so when I went to them with my story, which was only like very short at that point, and they said, we would like to do a book with you. And I said, well, what else would I write about? And they said, you can write about anything you like. We want to hear what a woman like you has to write about today in Ireland. And that was enormously liberating. I just thought, wow, I've just been given this huge permission. And I mean, I can't believe so many of us wait for permission from someone else, but we do. And I was. And so sometimes the answer to the question of how did you write the book is kind of by accident, right? I didn't intend to write it. But also when I look back, I think very deliberately, because it is part of, I think, and the ambassador referred to this too, I think a narrative of women's voices finally being heard in Ireland after decades. You know, we see life basically getting better for women and people in general in Ireland over the past several decades, where huge shifts in cultural views around women have allowed women to feel that finally women have always been telling their stories, but not being heard. Mm-hmm. And I think of how Tramp Press are really interested in kind of breaking those taboos, and how that was my way into joining a larger cultural movement towards openness and honesty.
That's so interesting. And all innovative in the sense that it was one of the first, let's say, essays, autobiographical writing written in the form of essays. There were, of course, memoirs, longer memoirs by Nuala Welland, but I think together with Jeanette Gleason's Constellations, your book was one of the first of this kind of new literary trend, don't you think, as compared to other places where there is a longer collection of essays by women writing their own autobiography?
Yeah, I was reading a lot of American writers, right? Because there's this huge tradition of women writing nonfiction essays in the US, and that they're both personal and political at the same time. And I just loved reading work by Joanne Beard, by Megan Daum, by Ariel Levy, by all these women who were telling deeply personal stories, but didn't feel solipsistic at all, because they were actually describing what are realities for so many people. And yet, as you say, there was no tradition of that in Ireland at all. We do have a really strong autobiographical tradition. And maybe people had published memoirs with very short sections. Brian Dillon is a good example, but they were not called essays. And in fact, I think that's partly for a marketing reason, right? When I told my friends, we think of essays as being the things we write in school or in college, right? They're not like, and I told my friends, oh, I'm writing a book. And they said, ooh, what's the book? And I said, it's a collection of essays. And they were like, oh, okay. And, my very good friends promised me they would read it. But I kept saying to Tramp Press, this is a terrible idea. This is a terrible idea. And they said, you have to trust it. And because they have that visionary quality, they had a sense that actually this was a moment where that kind of international form would start to appeal to an Irish audience. And it really has. You see multiple essay collections out now in relation to people writing about their lives. I think of Tramp Press published Deireadh Ní Ghríofa's The Ghost in the Throat, which just won Book of the Year. So they have a good tradition of winning that prize. Or Patrick Frayn's collection of essays, Okay, Let's Do Your Stupid Idea, which is a great title, and in where he writes about his experience of childlessness, for example, and infertility. And I think, oh, okay, it's not just women who suffer from these taboos, right? Where you're talking about infertility or miscarriage, or in particular, you're talking about two people usually. And so that idea of it being only women, I think, is slightly reductive. What I really like to see is that sense of connection happening now.
And why is it important? How useful is the genre of short stories, of essays? Emilie, do you prefer this form rather than writing a memoir in a longer narrative?
Yeah, I mean, writing a memoir was kind of start to finish. Felt a bit strange when I was only 40, and when I wrote it. What I really like about essays is, as a reader, I love how short and intense they are. Right, you really get something. There's no extra stuff. There's no making cups of tea and things in the narrative. Right, it's all the goods, and then it's over, and you can walk away, and you can. I mean, I know you said you read notes to self in one reading. I think that's extreme. I'm like, take breaks. And as a writer, I really love them because for me, my approach is thematic. So one essay is about my relationship with my father and him being in hospital. One essay is called The Baby Years, which is about the years of trying to become a parent. One essay is called Teaching and Learning, which is about trying to work and be a professional and an academic. And so that sense that I could look at one thing at a time in detail under the microscope, but not have to do the larger story.
Okay. Well, from my say, I find that you speak so beautifully about, issues which are so painful for many women. I mean, like the hurt that accompanies miscarriages, how painful it is for a woman to want to be a mother and not being able to be a mother. And of course, how for many pregnant women, they can only view their bodies in terms of failure, in terms of absence. I think it's so important that you raise awareness on these issues. So, Emilie, quoting your words in the first essay, you claim that writing, and I'm quoting your words here, is a way of making sense of the world, a way of possessing thought and emotion, a way of making something worthwhile out of pain. And I would like to ask you regarding the catharsis that accompanies this sort of revisiting of your life, when writing with such an honesty, with such authenticity, in a way you are also going through the experience over again. So it must be really difficult and tough for you to relive all these experiences. So liberating at the same time, but also you go through the pain again, don't you?
Yeah, I think you do. And I think you have to, if you want to write well about an experience, and if you actually want to make a connection with somebody else through your writing. If you hold back, a reader knows. And so I think in terms of good writing, that's what I wanted to do, was to create the sense of this is the actual experience. The second strand of that, and you're absolutely right, is the emotional nature of writing about it is both liberating and re-traumatizing. And that's because, some of the experiences in the book were very, very recent. I wrote about my dad in hospital at that time. So it really did feel cathartic in that sense of trying to process it in the moment. Some of the experiences had happened over 20, 25 years previously, and I had allowed myself to forget about them. And sometimes remembering is a really positive experience and something that we need to go through. And sometimes I think allowing ourselves to forget very difficult experiences is actually how we get on with our day-to-day life. And so silence isn't always a negative quality, right? It can actually be quite protective of the self as well. Sometimes to feel silenced is a terrible experience, but to feel like you are allowing yourself the grace of silence can actually be a very safe place to be, a very kind of a space with a lot of integrity to it. Mm-hmm. So the process of writing was, I think, constantly moving between those poles and also thinking about other people's feelings as well. I thought about experiences that I had had, as a teenager when I was still living with my mother, that she would only know about from reading the book, right? She had no idea of how I had, been involved in a very heavily drinking and drug taking kind of culture as a teenager. And I felt very deep shame for breaking that. She had this idea of her little girl, and she knew I was in trouble in lots of ways because I kept getting kicked out of schools, right? So she knew this. This is the funny story in my family. It's funny, isn't it? The way in families we turn quite difficult experiences into funny stories. Oh, and then Emily got asked to leave another school.
Humor.
Exactly, but we don't ask because actually it would be very painful to know the reality behind things. And so there had been this kind of unknown quality in my relationship with my mother that the book swept away. So she now knows it kind of nuts and bolts, and it was very hard for her. I could see her, you know, how painful it was for her to have to live her daughter's pain. And I think that we are much stronger now. But I am still, I don't feel regret, but it is hard what we do to ourselves, and it is hard what we do to our parents or the people who love us as well. So yeah, it's an all family experience, this book. But I also think that, and my mother always said this, that she saw the wider benefit of writing about things that people don't write about. She has been a public servant all her career, and that's very strong sense of kind of civic duty. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think of like, okay, how do we make this a better country? And I think it is. I think it is a better country. And the book in Ireland came out just after the referendum to legalise abortion.
Yeah.
And that was in 2018. And that whole 6 months leading up to the referendum, and I was, you know, part of the campaign and knocking on doors and asking people to vote yes. That whole campaign, we saw so many people tell deeply personal stories of their experience of terminations for a variety of reasons, and how important it was, not just in a discourse of rights, but in a sense of, right, these are real people and real stories. And there is that purpose, right, of sharing our stories. It's not just personal, it is political, and it is about social values.
And indeed, you talk, I think it's in the second essay, From My Baby Years, about the lack of medical transparency that has accompanied treatments of childbirth, of miscarriages, and yeah, certainly. So that's so important.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. No, unfortunately, I'm sure it's the same in so many countries. I'm sure it's the same in Spain, where medicine does not treat patients, and in particular women, like the owners of their own bodies. Mm-hmm. Right?
Mm-hmm. You have talked, Emilie, about this strong movement out of the personal into the political, and indeed, you know, they tend to identify autobiography as self-indulgent. But you know, when I was reading your work, I completely thought about the author. I completely forgot about the author. I felt so identified with many of the things that you were saying. So I think actually autobiography, it's not self-indulgent. It's actually the contrary, because it actually allows this sort of a strong identification between, people. And we tend to be encouraged not to talk about failure, but it's actually those kind of things that allows us to strongly connect with the other, right? So, yeah. Which is the reaction of readers that you have found after publishing this book? I'm sure that...
I think you're right. Those are the things we have in common, right? Those are the things. Success is all very good and well, but actually it's our failures and that sense of having failed that allow people to show us compassion. And so I have had an awful lot of compassion from kind of people who have read it. And I've also heard a lot of people's stories. I get a lot of emails in particular. Mm-hmm. And because I'm at a university, my email is, publicly available. And so it's really easy for people to get in touch with me, which I love. And a lot of, particularly women, sharing their stories. They're hopeful, joyful stories, but also huge number of people sharing stories of loss. And I think that accusation, right, that autobiography is self-indulgent. There are different forms of self-indulgence, but I think women are taught not to be self-indulgent, right? If you listen to yourself, if you pay attention to yourself, that's somehow a negative thing. Absolutely not. To pay attention to yourself and to treat yourself as important and and the protagonist of your own story strikes me as being a really positive move in many ways. And I think that's sometimes what people connect to, right? And the word honest gets used about the book as well, that if you encounter somebody else's honesty, perhaps it's what allows you to think honestly or give yourself space to think about yourself. Absolutely. And one of the striking things that I have found is a lot of women who get in touch with me and say, oh, this is my story as well. And they will then tell me their story. And it's nothing like my story, right? It's fundamentally different. And so they don't mean like as in identical. They mean emotionally the same, right? I feel the same. I have been through something. You have been through something. And now we have this connection. And I think that's a kind of solidarity that is very powerful.
That's so interesting, Emilie. Now that you are talking about solidarity among women, would you consider your work as feminist? I'm thinking about one of the poets I admired most in Ireland, Evan Boland. She famously claimed that she was a feminist, but not a feminist poet. And of course, you have been involved into many feminist movements in Ireland recently. Well, not so recently now, but the Waking the Feminists movement. You have been involved in creating a gender policy for the Abbey Theatre in order to guarantee the implication of women as playwrights, as producers. And your book has been so important for many women. So would you consider your writing feminist?
Absolutely. Shortest answer of the day. Like 100%. I was raised in an all-female household. I couldn't be more feminist. What I find amazing is that two things, which is that even though I count myself as having been raised a feminist and doing everything in work and in my life to try and live those values, which are values of equality and fairness and openness, I still really struggle. It's still really hard. There are still so many negative patriarchal values ingrained in my head where, I think, oh, she should behave in such and such a way, or, thinking of, even using language like, oh, the masterful way, or, how it's a process of constantly decolonizing yourself, right? I was also really struck when I started teaching in UCD in 2008, which is quite a long time ago. And I had a first year course called Writing the Body. And we did Virginia Woolf, and we did, a whole load of really great texts on that course. And I started out the first seminar by saying, who here is a feminist, right? And to be met with this resounding no. With, all of the students, female and male, looking at the table, really embarrassed, not going to, and people who said, who literally said things like that we're done with that now. And for a really long time, I think there was a post-feminist narrative that we were done with that now, and that to be a feminist was a bit embarrassing or a bit, extreme or left-wing. And what I've really enjoyed in the past few years is a resurgence of just even being allowed to use the word and to say there are still so many strides that need to be made. I mean, you bring up Evan Boland, and a couple of years ago, there was a Cambridge Companion to Irish Poetry, where there were hardly any Irish women poets included. In 2016, the National Theatre, to celebrate the centenary of the Easter Rising, put on 10 plays, 8 of them by men, and the 2 by women, and one was from the archive and one was for children, because women and children go together, right? I mean, we're not done. We're just not done. And it is wonderful to talk to women who are changing things, and for us to actually be done. Where are the men? What are the men doing to change it? Why are men not being asked what their feminist credentials are? It needs to be a much larger conversation.
Mm-hmm. Emilie, you mentioned in particular stages in the book that women tend to be over-identified with their female bodies still, even nowadays. Could you comment on that a little bit further on? Do you think that's particularly or, you know?
I missed part of that, but yes, I do think we are over-identified with our bodies. I think that there is still very much that binary of men are cultural and women are natural, and that if a woman has a particular view or reacts in an angry way, for example, it must be her hormones, it must be her body speaking. And sometimes it is, right? Sometimes it is your body. Sometimes you're having a very bad day because your hormones have plunged and, you know, your estrogen is disappearing and you basically want to go back to bed, right? So I don't think we should deny our bodies at all. I think having an open conversation around the role that our bodies play in our lives is really important. I'm always struck by this. I'm a theatre critic, right? And yet when you read theatre reviews, it's all what's happening on the stage. Reviewers and academics almost never talk about the fact that there's an audience with bodies sitting, you know, in an auditorium. I mean, we haven't done it for a year, but I really look forward to getting back to being in a crowded room. But that sense of the body always getting left behind, and we're so focused on our minds, and that not only do we lose our bodies, but I think we lose our emotions as well.
You know, as a woman myself, I felt really identified and also empowered by your essay on the explanation of what it means for a woman to have the period, you know, and these kind of things don't get to be talked about. And that essay works very well with my male students, and they say, you know, it was interesting for me, you know, I got to understand my girlfriend now better, and you know, and also how this sort of discourse tends to be silenced in media, as you very well claimed, the blue liquid instead of the blood for selling sanitary napkins, these kind of things, you know?
I know. And I think that I wrote that essay because I was so afraid of the subject, right? And it was the essay in the book that I thought, okay, make yourself write this, Emilie, you know? Where I just thought, okay, where you've grown up with a taboo, it was a taboo for me. It's not that I am so liberated or free of that problem. It's that I couldn't say the word period to my boyfriend of 15 years, my partner, you know, who I've tried to have children with. So that sense of bodily intimacy is very hard sometimes to move into language when we feel that there's so much shame attached to the language. So I use the word period now as much as possible and menstruation, and talk about it. And I mean, God, I sound unbearable. But that sense that it was really for me to try and get over it. And now I can't believe that I had such a hang up about it. But I do think, and I have had a number of men, in fact, you know, one of my good friends who's married and has children saying, oh, I understand now. And I was like, really, what are we doing? That we can't talk to each other.
Exactly. So I, from that perspective, I think that, you know, it's very important also for men to read this kind of writings. Emilie, you have mentioned.
Sorry, no, I was just going to say, you mentioned Nuala of Whalon earlier, and she published her first autobiography, Are You Somebody, in like 1997. And I remember reading that and thinking, oh, this is the first time. She talks a lot about, not a lot, but she talks about her sexual relationships with various men and with one woman. And I remember her talking about the experience of having sex and then how it felt afterwards and how she made sense of it in the course of her life. And I thought, this is the first time I have ever seen this. I have never seen this written down before. And you know, we were very different as people, but I was like, oh, this is my life. And it's incredibly empowering, I think, to see so many writers doing that. And I think that's why women's writing, and obviously it's nice to think of it on St. Bridget's Day, to think of this kind of lineage, right, of women writers who it would be impossible to write notes to self it would be impossible to write that without those other books coming beforehand, you know, and without that sense of wanting to emulate what really brave women writers did for so many decades when they had no support. I mean, I think of so this is a kind of a Spanish book. Obviously, this is Kate O'Brien's Mary Lavelle, which is set just outside Bilbao, and was banned in Ireland for years because of its representation of sex. And you think about the number of writers who have had to, I mean, break taboo boundaries. So this is a description of kind of having sex for the first time. It's a wonderful novel. I really recommend it. I love it. And I recommend her Spanish travelogue as well, Farewell Spain, which she wrote just at the beginning of the Spanish Civil War. But it's, you know, you read these books and you realize that women were breaking those taboos and those boundaries in their writing and in their work and in their lives, and getting shut down, right? Literally getting censored. And their careers, like Kate O'Brien is now kind of one of Ireland's most famous women writers. But for so long, she struggled to pay her rent, you know, so it's kind of extraordinary to see the contrast between then and now, and to think that without writers like her, you know, Sinead Gleeson couldn't be writing now, Deirdre Ní Gríofa couldn't be writing now.
Yeah, it's funny that you have mentioned Kate O'Brien, because I was actually going to ask you that. I heard that The Land of Spices was one of your favorite books.
Yes,
what is it
absolutely.
about that book that you like so much? The Land of Spices.
Yeah, which was also banned. I loved it. It's the story of an older and a younger woman. So the older woman is a nun, and the girl is a student in the convent school which the nun teaches at. And the way that they both that they relate to each other, I think when I read it first, talking about breaking taboos, divorce was illegal in Ireland until 1997, right? We had a referendum on it in 1995 to legalize it. And when I first read that book, it was before the divorce referendum had come, and the younger girl in it, her parents are separating. And obviously the novel is set in the 1940s, when it was completely unthinkable for that to happen. And my parents had separated when I was 5 years old, and we had gone through the 1980s where, you know, felt like there was referendum and event after event which told women they were second-class citizens, and single parent families were the source of all, you know, social wrongs and crime and so on. Social breakdown was our fault. And so, you know, reading those stories, which in some ways like very, very different to your own life, but in fiction, how Kate O'Brien was really changing things. It's also just a beautiful novel, right? It's just a really lovely novel about two people, one growing up into her life and the other looking back on her life and trying to make sense of it. And the experience of kind of how through their connection with each other, they find a love. Yeah. And now I'm a teacher, right? So I have to believe that education does that for people.
And education in a way saved you as well, or has saved all of us. It has saved me as well. It's a way of, don't you think?
Yeah.
You have there your Spanish translation of Notes to Self. Could you show it to the camera? Todo lo que no puedo decir. The title changes completely. All those things I cannot say. It changes completely the title in English, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I suppose so this is in 15 languages now, which is lovely. Wow. And in so many languages, Notes to Self does not translate, right? It doesn't really mean anything. I meant that for me, the English language title means something that I wrote for myself, and something that is a way of, you know, if you're constantly trying to self-improve, you're like, okay, I must do this, must do this, must do this. So that sense of kind of trying to hold yourself to account. But it doesn't make sense in lots of languages. And so we came up with this alternative title, Everything That I Cannot Say, or All That I Cannot Say, or All the Things I Can't Talk About, and allowed publishers to choose which they wanted to use. And I like the second title, the Spanish title, very much, because I think it gets to the heart of that contradiction of speaking but not being listened to, or not even feeling like you have the right to speak, right? And for a really long time, when I didn't have a title for the book, I kept thinking, okay, what is the unifying theme of this book? And it's all the things that you will only admit to yourself, you know, in the very early hours of the morning when you've woken up and you can't sleep and it's dark and you're lying there and you're thinking, my life is such a shipwreck, right? And I hope nobody else knows, and I'm such a fraud and I'm such an imposter. All of those fears, it's our 4 a.m. brain, right? That's when they come up. So I wanted people to have a sense that was what was in the book, that this is that we feel that there is something that is telling us to not speak these things. So for me, it kind of gets to the heart of what the book is about.
How conscious were you of creating a particular voice, of using a particular style when writing? I know that you have been asked this before, but I'm curious of your answer. I heard you mentioning once that you tried not to be too intrusive when talking about yourself, and I was curious about that. Are you conscious of a voice when writing?
Yeah, I mean, the main thing for me has always been when I was in university in first year, I read a feminist essay saying that as feminists, feminism was about democratizing systems, right? And as a result, we should write clearly so that anybody and everybody can read it. So just because you're an academic, you shouldn't write in an elite language that doesn't allow people to understand you. So I have always had this sense that writing is about communicating. So for me, so much of style is about clarity, right? Is about, let's work out how best to put this across. The other answer to that is that Tramp Press, the editors at Tramp Press said to me, "Oh, we love your style." And I said, I don't have a style, because I thought you had to write like John Banville to have a style, and use metaphors and things. And I was like, that's just what it sounds like in my head. And they said, no, that is your style, Emilie. That is your voice. And I thought, oh, it's okay to sound like, for your writing to sound like the voice in your head. And that's not an easy thing to do. I think it's difficult to try to put what you actually feel down on paper. Anne Patchett once described it as being like, the story you imagine and the voice you imagine is like a butterfly, and it's very, very beautiful. And then when you write it, you have to kill it and pin it to the page. It no longer, it loses some of its life in that process. And I think sometimes writing feels like that it's never going to be what you always have a bigger ambition for it than you can ever really achieve, but you do your best.
Well, you have a beautiful voice, certainly. I know that. One final question before opening the floor, because I have the questions here, lots of questions that I want to ask you. But how does your academic work inform your writing? I'm thinking about your important research on projects related to the past, to commemorating the past properly, to ethical memory, which you have written about so beautifully. I mean, the fact of remembering the past in such a way that we don't make the same mistakes in the future or in the present. And when reading your book of essays, in a certain way, when you revisit you're also doing an act of self-reflection in a way. And in the opening essay, you talk about how your version of the past is different from your father's version of the past. So I know this is a very sort of abstract question, but how does your academic work as a teacher, as a researcher, inform your writing?
So when I was writing the book, I think I would have said they were completely separate, because I wanted this to be a project that I was doing for myself entirely. But of course it isn't. So I work a lot on memory theory. I know full well, and I teach my students all the time, that memory is constantly evolving, that it's a subjective process, and that it's creative, not, you're not just retrieving the past, you're recreating the past when you remember it, and certainly when you write it. I try to make everything as accurate as possible, but it will always be from my perspective, and it will always be from my perspective now. So even when I write about myself as a troubled 15-year-old, I write about that as someone who is, you know, in her 40s, who is safe, who has a good job, you know, who made it. So it has a different kind of storyline to it. But I also think about the work that I do with survivors of institutional abuse. And I think the most profound work that I've done in that regard has been an oral history project that I've been running with the National Folklore Collection, which is housed at UCD, where we have met with people who feel that the official state processes have not allowed them to tell their story. And it happens constantly because, you know, we just had the publication of the Mother and Baby Home Report, which, you know, took survivor testimony and contradicted it in the process of writing the report. And in my mind, that goes completely against the ethics of listening, and where you allow the person who is talking to be the expert and to be the person who owns their own narrative. And so in the National Folklore, and it's easy for me because I'm not writing a report, right? I have a very different goal in mind, which is to allow people to own their own story. And so with Dr. Krista McCarthy at the National Folklore Collection, we meet with people and we allow them to talk for however long they want to talk. We will record it, and we get somebody to transcribe the recording. We bind that recording, we bind the transcription, they get a copy of the audio recording, and they get a bound copy of their own story. And I know in one case I was talking to one man who had been born in a mother and baby home, and he had been in an industrial school. He had been adopted to abusive parents. He'd, you know, had to run away from that. He'd had a really, really hard life. And he took his story and he gave it to his two sons because he had never told them. And they read it. And for the first time, they understood. And they said, "Oh, we understand where you came from, Dad." And that, to me, is the purpose of memory and storytelling and what we can do. And that's meaningful solidarity. And I think that sense of intimacy is really, really important, right? Just keeping it small and allowing the individual to really matter in that context. And as I say that, I think that Pilar is gone, is frozen, is disappeared. I can keep talking for a while. I'm not sure if anybody out there has seen the Mother and Baby Home Report. It seems like an interesting thing to talk about on St. Bridget's Day anyway, and the way in which, how to put it, the way in which society has, I think, allowed certain women to have their own stories.
I am back here.
You're back, yay!
I am back. Thank you, Emilie. You are commenting on this so important project. Just to let everybody know, is that digitally available online, these reports that you were mentioning?
So all of the reports are available online. The report into the Ryan Commission from 2009, the Mother and Baby Home Commission, the Magdalene report, they're all available online. The Folklore Collection project that I do, the Oral History Project, is not available. These people are still alive and they have the right to their privacy. So we hold it in the National Folklore Collection so that it is part of the national story, and it will become available at a time when survivors want it to. It's up to them, their decision, but for the moment it's private. It's a process, I think, that is really important to keep safe.
Absolutely. Well, huge congratulations on the important work you are doing, you know, professionally as an academic.
Thank you. Yeah, it's nice to do what feels like meaningful work, right? I think Pilar is having connection issues. I'm really sorry. And I'm afraid I can't hear the ambassador. No, you're back. We almost got there, right? We almost got through an hour of being connected. And I know people are asking questions, so I'd love to talk about them, but I can't hear anybody.
I can come in. Sorry, Rory, the tech guy here. I have the questions, Emily, if you want me to ask you them in lieu of Pilar, and you can.
That might work, yeah, if you don't mind.
Okay. Sorry, this was a plan B. So the first question we have, Emily, is actually from a colleague of mine, from Deirdre, and she has a question related to Sally Rooney, which is, what's your thoughts on Sally Rooney's work? How do you feel it's impacted in kind of the world of literature? And does it transfer beyond Ireland? For her, reading Sally Rooney's books has been a highlight of our lockdown here in Madrid, so she's interested in hearing your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, Sally is great. I love her writing, and I think it's great to see a young writer getting as much, having as much of an impact as she's having. And I think the television series of Normal People that she also did the screenplay for got a lot of people through lockdown as well in Ireland and abroad. Yeah, I mean, again, I think that stories, and Sally tends to tell stories of vulnerable, in particular, young women, and in the case of Normal People, young men too. And I think the vulnerability is something that readers really connect to. And I enjoy her writing style. It's very clear and very open, and I think that's very interesting. I think, from my perspective, I think it's, and this is not about Sally, but about something larger. It would be lovely to see more happy endings, just in general, in fiction around women, and plays around women. There was a period there where I was going to the theatre, and every play by women ended in, the woman taking her own life, and that's a really, really sad scenario. And there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of eating disorders and so on in Sally Rooney's work as well. And so it's just hard to see the continuation of so many of these difficult experiences having to be reflected in fiction, because we're still dealing with them as issues.
That's a very interesting answer, Emily. I'm going to hand back to Pilar because I see she's joined and she's the expert, so I will bow out.
Thank you, Rory.
Rory, the second question was yours, so probably you are the best person to make that question. Well, I will read it anyway. Rory was asking whether Note to Self is your story, Emily, but it also involves the stories of those closest to you. How did they feel about you making them so public?
I think I have parents who are very understanding, and who always wanted me to be a writer. And so this, unfortunately, is the consequence of that. I think they're very proud. And I think it was particularly hard on my parents in slightly different ways. My dad, because the book is very explicit about the degradation that happens when somebody goes into intensive care, when he was nearly bleeding to death and so on. And to see himself described like that on the page, I think was very hard for him. But he saw it, as he said, he thought that it was really important to tell this story. And it's actually very proud of it, I think. My mother is from a generation of Irish people who would much rather not talk about the bad things that are happening, as a survival mechanism, right? As a way of protecting your family. And so she found it much harder initially, but then I think started to see the impact of it on people that she knew, who would come up to her and say, oh, that happened to me with my daughter as well. And so again, that sense of solidarity, I think, boosted them. 2.5 years on, and I think my parents are ready to stop talking about Note to Self. My mother says, the next person who says, are you Emilie Pine's mother? I'm just going to say no. I'm just going to say, you're nothing to do with me.
That's the problem of becoming a bestseller, dear Emily. Well, they have been supportive as well, and so.
Exactly. Hugely, and really excited, and they see the change that has made in my life. And my mum saw me go through not becoming a parent, and the kind of loss that is. And so I took a lot in Notes to Self about that difficulty. And now I almost feel like my public service announcement is slightly different. I think having written Notes to Self and had that experience, I feel like saying, you know, I didn't have kids. I'm on the other side, and there are advantages, right? I have kinds of freedom as a woman that I would not have if I were also a mother. And I have a really happy life. And I think that, to bring it back to my parents, I think that has been really important for my parents, who feel the loss of grandchildren as well, and experience my sense of loss, but also get to see me be really happy and fulfilled. And that's what any parent wants.
Exactly. Absolutely. Manu and Jens from the University of Granada. Your book echoes the conflicts of neoliberalism, cuts to public services in healthcare, education, the need to produce children, work to feel successful. To what extent do you think this critique informs your work, and has writing about these experiences made you become more aware of an attempt to change the demands others place on us, we place on ourselves?
That's a really great question, and formulated probably better than I can answer it in some ways. I think that initially I was writing from the inside of the experience of feeling hugely overworked, hugely burnt out, that sense of failure, both personally and professionally, constantly feeling like an imposter, constantly feeling like I wasn't doing enough and I wasn't performing enough. And I needed to, as that was a terrible experience, that was a very terrible experience of burnout. And I needed to write about it. So it's the last essay in the collection. When I was writing it and having written it, I now see that as part of a larger system. There cannot be so many of us as individuals burning out in our lives and our work lives for it to be an individual problem. It is a systemic and cultural problem. And there are two aspects to it: structural, which is this constant emphasis, which is the cuts to public services, this constant emphasis on produce more, and then cultural, which is, you know, in order to look like a successful person, you have to be too busy, you have to be stressed all of the time. And you know, identifying, I think, what we can do about that. So for me, it has been trying to, and it's really hard to do, trying to redefine what success means. And success means not being so exhausted I could feel like I'm going to die. You know, like why is that our definition of success? Success means, you know, having time to spend with my family, having time to play with my nephew, and, you know, create Lego villages and things. That is actually a marker of having a much more successful life. And
of course,
rather than, as the person who asked the question says, consuming all the time. Instead, I think creativity can be a really interesting response to that, whether that's creativity through play or through writing or through going for a walk or through just noticing the world around you. But it's very hard to, it feels like a conscious uncoupling. It feels like deliberately enforcing your boundaries. And a friend of mine made the observation that institutions will always put themselves first, their needs first, whether that's the institution of marriage or the institution of the university or the institution of the government, will always put its own needs first. And so you have to separate from that and put your own needs first if you want to have your own boundaries and keep yourself safe within them.
Great. John Liddy is asking, the O'Brien writers, Kate and Edna, greatly contributed to the improved standing of women writers in Ireland today. What do you think?
Yes, huge vote. Go read them. Rather than listen to me talk about them, go read them. Read Land of Spices, read Mary Lavelle, read the Country Girls trilogy. Extraordinary careers and insights into the psychology of the characters. They're very character driven, not writers, and I think it's fascinating. So and not dated at all. Really fascinating.
Great. An anonymous listener is asking, what would you say to a girl who suffered from eating disorders in the past and still suffers from them, but is afraid to tell her loved ones?
That is such a hard question, isn't it, Pilar? I was never brave enough to do it at the time. It's really hard. It's funny. I think with eating disorders, you always carry the shadow of your disordered self inside you, right? I will never have a neutral relationship to food because of all of the values that it is. I would say, I would really say it's about that eating disorders are around feeling unsafe, and feeling out of control. And so if it's important to this person to tell somebody, then find someone who helps them feel safe and helps them feel like they have control over their own story, and share it with one person first. And there is no compulsion to do that unless you think it is going to help you. If you think it is going to harm you, then find someone else to tell. And it can be a therapist, right? It can be, there is huge value in talking to strangers who don't have any preconception of you and don't judge you based on that. So I think therapy has, for me, helped me see myself and my life differently. And so I think loved ones play a really important role in making us feel loved, and therapy is really important for taking us out of the context of the family and allowing us to talk about it first, and supporting us then maybe in telling our loved ones.
Mm-hmm. And this question is also related to your comments now. Silvia Martin from Granada, do you think that exposing your experiences has changed your way to see things and has helped you to rediscover yourself?
Okay. Yes, I do. I think, and this is why not everyone is mad enough to publish a memoir, right? Because it's slightly extreme thing to do. But I think everybody should try writing. I think enormously therapeutic. And this comes back to that line that you quoted from the book earlier about possessing our own stories. I think when you write, you get to decide what your story is. You're the author of it. Often in life, it feels like events are constantly happening to us. But when you write, you pick out the things you think are significant and how you want to tell them. What plot are you going to use? And in a non-fiction way, but still get to decide what the story is. And so I think that's both creative and constructive for ourselves. So please write about your lives, even if you're not in any way interested in showing anybody else. Do it for yourself.
Okay. And a final question, Emilie, from Chiara. Do you think contemporary work coming out of Ireland, including yours, is easier to relate to in other cultures than classic narratives of Irish experience?
I don't know. I mean, I actually think someone outside of Ireland is probably better placed to answer that question. I mean, I think there's a universality, right, to so many experiences. There are very particular historical contexts, like the famine, like the War of Independence, like, you know, the propensity to emigration and so on. But there's also a religious narrative which connects so many of us that have like a really strong Catholic Church in their countries and cultures and traditions. And then there's just the experience of being human. We are all human, and I wouldn't want to overstress the differences between us. There are those differences, and we should celebrate and recognize them and try to aspire to have the best set of values that we have. But people bleed, and people hurt, and people are joyful, and people celebrate, and people have families everywhere. So wherever the writing is from or about, I think if it has those values at its center, then it's absolutely going to translate. And I think, you know, think about the modernity of a play like An Trial by Mairead Ní Gráda, which is, you know, 60 years old, and thinking about, you know, how that has to do with a society that doesn't exist anymore, and yet still totally relevant, totally connected to it these days.
Good. Before letting you go, Emilie, I'm obliged to ask you, I know that you are writing a draft for another book. Would you like to talk about that? Have you thought about moving into fiction, prose, poetry? You were talking before about Dorian Negrife. I don't know. What is that?
I'm not a poet.
At the moment.
I am not a poet. I will leave that to the poets. So yeah, I would love to write more. I think it's a very difficult time to be thinking about things other than writing, because we're doing so much work towards, online teaching and all the rest. I was writer in residence for a time at the National Maternity Hospital in Dublin. And my hope is that there's something in there that will inspire the next book. But it's funny because I bumped into Marina Carr a while ago, right, when you were allowed to bump into people, and I bumped into her. And she had been writer in the maternity hospital as well. And she said, "How's it going?" And I said, "I'm completely lost. I don't know what I'm doing." And she said, "Oh, that's great. That's great."
That's the first stage.
Academics think that's terrible, right? But writers, you're all like, "Oh, creativity is about being lost." And I'm like, "Sounds dreadful." So, yeah, there's something. It's easier to write your own story because I knew the plot already. Finding the next story. But I trust that it will be there, and it will take time.
Okay. Well,
I will find my way.
We are really looking forward to seeing that book at some stage. Thanks. It has been lovely talking to you. I'm so glad we had the chance to meet each other, at least, through this medium. Apologies for, the last part. I would have loved to have had this conversation in the actual venue of the Irish Embassy in Madrid, which is beautiful, but hopefully next time. So thanks everybody as well for being here. I've been told that there will be a recording available afterwards of this conversation, and that the embassy will tweet the link on the embassy's Twitter feed. So thanks so much, Emilie, for granting us your time. After I know that you have a very busy agenda and you have a teaching now in 25 minutes. So I hope you keep safe and stay healthy and in these difficult times. And thanks everybody who has been connected. And we hope that you keep connected with all the wonderful cultural events that are organized at a regular basis by the Irish Embassy in Madrid.
Thank you so much, Pilar. It was so nice talking to you. We will be together again.
I'm sure we will.
Yeah. And thank you so much to the embassy for organizing this event. It's been just a treat to have a conversation with a friend.
Thank you, Emilie. Stay well. Love
you too.
all of you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.